host this forum today. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. I want to take a moment, and if you will just take a moment and look around and notice the exit nearest you. There are a few behind you. There are also ones on either side of the stage. And while you're here today, I want to invite you, as we invite every audience at Highland Center for the Arts, to disconnect and turn off your cell phones and truly connect with what's going on stage. There's so much going on here that we want you to be fully present for it. So thank you so much for coming. Without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome to the Highland Center for the Arts VTDigger's founder and editor-in-chief, Anne Galloway, who is herself from Hardwick. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm so pleased to be near my hometown, Hardwick. So thank you all for coming out, and I know there's some students in the audience, and this is for course credit, so listen closely. We're going to be taking questions from readers tonight. We sent out questions over the course of the past couple of weeks, and we have fabulous sample questions from our readers, so we'll be doing that. I also wanted to let you know that VTDigger is supported by readers, so if you're so inclined, we are in the middle of a news match, and so we encourage you to, if you read us, to support us. I also just wanted to let you know that we're going to be keeping this to an hour. Originally, we were looking at an hour and a half, but the candidates and I decided that was an awfully long time for you all to sit in your chairs to hear about politics, so we're going to keep it bright and tight, as they say in the broadcast business. We have done a coin toss with the candidates, and so we'll start with Don Turner, who is the minority leader of the House. He's a Republican from Milton, and then David Zuckerman will be following up with the second set of questions. David is the incumbent lieutenant governor, and he's a progressive/Democrat. What else on the housekeeping front? Let me see if I can read my notes. Yeah, we're keeping it to an hour. That's the main message here. Okay. Well, if the candidates would join us now, David and Don. Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you. Good luck. Thank you. So we're going to keep the answers to the questions to about 90 seconds. And Dylan, where are you? Oh, boy, I can barely see you with these beautiful lights. That's the other thing I forgot. Thank you. I wanted to thank the Highland Center for the Arts for hosting this at their fabulous facility. So if we could give them a round of applause. So Dylan, you'll probably have to stand up for me because I'm having little visual problems here. All right, great. So the first question for you, Don, is what are examples of ways in which you've worked to improve opportunities for all children in our schools?
Thank you, Anne, for the question. I've worked across party lines a number of occasions on ways to improve both opportunities in school as well as school safety. As far as opportunities in school, we have done a number of things over the years in the legislature to promote quality education through efficiencies designed to benefit both the student and the taxpayer, as well as teachers. And most recently, we have done school safety. This year alone, we invested $5 million, which I fully supported, in school safety so that kids can go to school and feel safe. The reason this is very important to me is I had a public hearing in Milton during the whole gun debate, and it became very clear that the people in this room at this hearing were anti-changing gun laws, but there were 3 students in that room that I heard loud and clear who were very concerned about their safety. So the next day I went to work, I got the police chief to agree to allow patrol officers to be at the schools at every drop-off and pickup throughout the rest of the school year, and we're continuing that today. The other thing that we've done is that arrangement has grown our community policing program, as well as the interaction between the students and the police officers and the parents and the police officers. So I'm very proud of those things. We have a lot of work to do in Vermont in the schools. We have good schools. We just got to continue to work to make sure we can afford to sustain them going forward.
Thank you very much. Dave?
Well, thank you, Ann. Thank you for all of you here tonight and those who are watching online for attending this debate. With respect to public schools, I'm a product of public schools. I'm an incredibly strong supporter of our public schools in that fundamentally public schools are the greatest economic justice equalizer that's out there. And we have to make sure that we support our public schools, that we don't actually just continually as political leaders beat up on the schools and beat up on the spending without really talking about what is that money getting us. And what that money is getting us is actually some of the best rural schools in the country. When you look at test scores, not state by state comparison, but actually rural counties versus Vermont, which is essentially all rural counties, we're getting very good results compared to other states. So the first thing I would say I do is I support our public schools. I've supported them in the legislature for 20 years. As chair of the Agriculture Committee in the House, we've also passed a farm to school program to help encourage kids to learn where their food comes from, how to get their hands in the soil, and how to make that connection with who we are as Vermonters and our food and our water. I've also done work as Lieutenant Governor, initiating something we've called a youth initiative, traveling to schools all across the state, both high schools and elementary schools, to really try and reinvigorate the idea of what our democracy is, what participation is. It's not just voting, but actually communicating with legislators and other leaders what people want, and that even as young people who can't vote yet, they are actually represented by legislators in the census count, and they have a voice that they should use as well. So I've worked hard to empower young people to engage in the political process. I've also done a lot of work on the Education Committee to look at our implicit bias in our schools with respect to disciplinary action, where many young children of color are disproportionately impacted by suspensions and detentions disproportionate to their ratios in the schools. Why is that happening? We need to keep investigating that. And finally, I've worked hard to start the conversation around social services and our schools and how we can bring them together, and I'll touch on that a little bit later.
Thank you very much. You know, the IPCC report came out recently, and a lot of people are really concerned about climate change and the impact that those changes are going to have on the nation, the world, and of course our lives here in Vermont. And so one of our readers has asked, do you support and will you vigorously work for a tax on carbon and a ban on new fossil fuel infrastructure in Vermont? And Don, you're up next.
I was first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
That's
Dave,
okay.
Go ahead.
We'll keep you on track, Ann.
Okay, good.
Well, let me make it clear. When I first got engaged in any political involvement, it was actually as an activist outside of elected office around the issues of climate change and our environment back as a student at UVM. That's really the root of where some of my engagement in politics came from. And I will say 2 years ago, during the night that I was elected, and I should have been jubilant and happy, I was horror-struck by the national nightmare that was unfolding before us. And I thought about my 10-year-old daughter who was there with me that night, and I thought about two issues, climate change and the Supreme Court. And over these 2 years, we have seen horrific regression in both of those counts with respect to her individual freedoms and rights, and also all of our future with respect to our climate, our planet, our water, the fundamentals of who we are as beings on this planet. And so yes, I do support a carbon dividend. However, one thing I would be very clear, I support it so long as there are adjustments to be made for rural, long-distance commuters and for working class and working poor individuals who would be very hard affected by a regressive tax. This can be done in a way that makes it so that working people can be whole financially, and we can start moving away from fossil fuels as the basis for transportation and heat and all the different ways that it's impacting us. Not only is the IPCC report very frightening and damning of what's happening, but there's also reports coming out that our oceans have warmed significantly more than we thought. And that warm ocean water is what's leading to, frankly, these stronger hurricanes, the strongest hurricane ever to hit the Panhandle just last couple weeks ago. This is real. This is now, and if we don't do things like a carbon dividend, if we don't keep a goal like 90% renewable by 2050, which earlier in another debate my opponent said he does not support, I don't know what we're thinking. We have to be moving forward in this way. Thank you.
Thanks all. If you could hold your applause to the end, that would be helpful. Don, what's the answer for you?
No, I do not support a carbon tax of any shape or form. I do believe the science that talks about global warming, and I do believe that Vermont is making a difference in the way we've invested and we've passed laws on renewable energy. I am concerned that the 90% goal by 2050 is unrealistic, but I believe that we continue to strive in this way with a more realistic goal of 50 to 75% by that time. I fully support expanding renewable energy, hydro, solar, using new technologies that we know will be developed and are being developed as we speak. And we should continue to focus on local input. We have to be looking at appropriate siting, and communities should be involved in that. So I believe that we should be investing in energy efficiency initiatives, as well as continuing our investments in weatherization and so on. But I do not support a carbon tax.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. Sure. So if not a carbon tax, what? I mean, what are the alternatives? If you look at the IPCC report, there's a pretty hefty recommendation that they basically say it's the only way to change human behavior and to change the ultimate.
I do not support it, Ann, and I will not support a tax. I understand the report,
yeah,
but I also have traveled the state all summer long talking to Vermonters who cannot afford to stay here. And we have to deal with their ability to live and raise their families and work in the state as well. And I think that that's a crisis that we have to deal with now and continue to invest in renewables and so on the way we have.
Okay, thank you. Dave, could I ask you a follow-up question, sure, please? You say that there's a way to make this possible without hurting low-income people and people who have to commute a long way. What are the practical ways in which that may or may not be possible?
Sure, there's a couple different bills that have been introduced. Some reduce the electric bills for people every month to help change their economic circumstance, so what they might be putting into the gas tank, they won't be putting into their electric bill. We could also, as an employer, I know that my employees can put an adjustment on their W-2 to have less money withheld. So if we were to say you're going to get a carbon dividend at the end of every year based on the distance you commute or your economic circumstances, you could pre-plan for that by having less money taken out of your paycheck each week. And I just want to say we need vision. This idea that it's jobs and affordability versus the environment and climate change is not a visionary response. A visionary response is looking at how many jobs we've created doing both at the same time in our solar industry and others. And finally, the goal of 90 by 50 is completely attainable. If people think back 32 years from now, back in the 80s, and you think about what we were doing for energy, production, and use, and how far we've come with technological advances, do we not think that we can't do that again in the next 32 years to get by 2050, 90% renewable? I think we can.
Even if we doubled what we have achieved today, David, we'd only be at 40%. So it'd take another 32 years to get to 40%. So I'm not sure how we get to 90%.
Well, I'm just looking at where we've come with solar panels in the last 10 years in terms of efficiency, and we are doing that in many other ways. Geothermal is just taking off. We're looking at transportation improvements that are taking off. It's an exponential climb in what we've been able to do. And so again, from where we were 32 years ago to where we can be 32 years from now, I think we have the vision, and we have the smarts, and we have the work ethic, and we have the people that can do it.
Okay, thank you. David, this reader says, our understanding is that there's very little collaboration between the current lieutenant governor and the sitting governor. How can the lieutenant governor work to create a working partnership with the governor, whoever that governor might be?
Sure. Well, certainly one looks at our state in a unique way because very few states have separately elected governor and lieutenant governor. And what I can tell you is that soon after both the governor and I were elected, he called me into his transition office and said, it didn't work for me to be in the cabinet with Peter Shumlin, so I'm not planning for you to be in the cabinet. He's the governor, I'm the lieutenant governor, he gets to make that decision. However, in June of that year, after we'd both done a year of service in the legislative process, I called the governor and said, could we meet? And I brought to him 3 ideas that I said, we need to show this country under this first 6 months of the Trump administration that Republicans, progressives, and Democrats can work together. And we in Vermont have a history and a tradition of doing that, that you might run with party labels, but you serve all the people. I said, why don't you and I try and come up with something we could do together? Now, the first idea I knew he wasn't that supportive of, which was cannabis reform. But I said, if you want no new taxes and you want to care for our most vulnerable, this is your get-out-of-jail-free card, because there will be new revenues to cover the ability to pay for those services that you want to provide without new taxes on other services. Second, why don't we work on outside government funding sources to fund a research position at the University of Vermont for Lyme and tick-borne diseases, because Lyme disease is higher per capita in Vermont than any other state, and ticks don't care whether your blood is red or blue, and it's something we could show we could work on together, fundraising outside the State House. Or third, why don't we work on the true cost of education, which is social services in our schools. And we have our schools providing social services. We have human services providing social services, 2.4 billion, 1.7 billion. Let's go down to the front lines, see where we can blend those services, create a better continuum of service for better outcomes, and reduce some costs. That's something that I think all of us as Vermonters would find a good outcome, savings and better results. Unfortunately, he chose not to follow up with me on any of those, but I will try again in the coming biennium.
Thank you, Don.
So I've spent my whole life building relationships in all my jobs that I've had as fire chief, rescue chief. In many of these roles, you have to build teams. You have to focus on an issue and bring people together to do that. If I'm elected a lieutenant governor, I would continue to build on that ability to bring people together in a collaborative, balanced manner. You know, I've served my entire tenure in the legislature in the minority. The only way I could ever get anything done was to build relationships across party lines, focusing on issues and not partisanship. And we've done that over the years. I've done that over the years with many, many issues. So bringing people together, working with the governor, working with colleagues throughout the body to build bridges and to rise above our differences is what I would do. And I would plan to do that based on my experience that I have in the private sector, as well as my term in the legislature, where I already have relationships, and I will continue to work to build those moving forward. So my answer is more partnership focused on the issue and less partisanship.
Thank you, Don. On that note, you know, we had we had a delayed, we had several sessions this year, and adjournment in the past has been sort of mid-May, and because there was a disagreement over school funding again, it went on and on and on, and there was a threat that the state budget might not get passed at all, and that we might end up in a situation in which we'd start the year, you know, without a blueprint for spending. And I just wonder if you could talk about the acrimony, why that happened, and what your role in it was.
Sure, I can talk about that, Ann. So this issue was, from my perspective, poor communication amongst the parties. That's what I think it was. I feel that the majority, the administration, all of us should have been working a little bit closer together, sat down and worked this out far before the end of the session. I think the governor had made it very clear from the beginning that he wasn't going to support raising taxes. We also had talked about that. Why in a year when we had nearly $171 million in new revenue, unanticipated revenue, would we want to raise taxes on Vermonters? So I agree with the governor's goal of not raising taxes, and that's why I supported and we were able to sustain the vetoes. I just, again, could not justify raising any taxes when you have all that additional revenue. So going forward, I hope that we have a much more collaborative and bipartisan spirit with better communication than we had in this last session. And I would, as Lieutenant Governor, work to instill that and to bring those parties together way before the end of the session.
Okay, thank you. Dave?
Well, a couple things. I feel like it's a similar situation that's going on nationally. We hear Senator Flake and Senator Collins say they want to work in a bipartisan way, and it's a lot of talk, but when it comes down to the votes, they're always there on the partisan side of the line. And when you look at the budget, that was a tripartisan budget. All but, I think, 12 or 14 people voted for the budget, including all the Republicans on the Appropriations Committee. They felt it was a fiscally sound budget. In fact, it would have bought down some of our pension debt to the tune of $100 million over the next 20 years, which now is one of the prime reasons that Moody's just downgraded our state's rating. So when my opponent talks about working collaboratively, but then organizes an effort to sustain a veto of a budget that was broadly supported, again, 130 plus votes to 12 or 14 votes, that's not collaborative. My work in the legislature when I was in the minority party, back when the Republicans actually held the House and the Republican held the governor's office, I pushed through a medical cannabis law that people are very appreciative of, from seniors with arthritis to folks fighting cancer. That's how you get something done, is to actually get something successfully done for the people through a body that is not your party's majority.
Thank you very much. Dave, a reader is asking whether you feel we should raise the minimum wage. That's part one of the question. Part two is, what's the hourly wage you pay your employees?
I'm happy to answer. I think Don would have been first, but I'm okay with that. Because I did the
first.
You did collaboration?
Yeah.
First? My apologies. So I remember the second part of the question. The first part?
The first part was, do you feel we should raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? And
Yes.
if so, why? And what would that look like? I'm ad-libbing a little bit there.
That's fine.
And then the second half
What do we
is,
pay?
what do you pay your farm
Absolutely.
workers?
So two things. I'll answer the second part first. This year, our base pay for our workers was $12.83 an hour, which is about the equivalent of $15 an hour in those 2024 year that bill would have taken us to. So first of all, sometimes people get spooked by the $15 an hour if you're a small business owner, but frankly, if you're able to pay your workers or can work your way towards paying them about $12.80 an hour today, that's the equivalent of what you're going to be working towards over the next 6 years under the bill that, again, the governor vetoed and my opponent helped sustain that veto. I do support raising it to $15 an hour. While some would say, well, right now it's a good law, I supported the law with an inflationary adjuster, which is what is the law currently going forward, that's essentially saying, I support locking people into poverty wages and not doing anything to progress their ability to get more wages, to pay their bills, and rely less on state services going forward. We've seen a 40-year decline in working people's wages, whether they be minimum wage workers and middle-class workers under Reagan trickle-down economics. That is essentially what I call sponge-up economics. We've got the greatest concentration of wealth in wealthy people's hands today than we have since before the stock crash. I believe we need to do a steady and progressive increase, not just with inflation, but a little bit more, and continue to put more money in working people's pockets. Finally, some say, well, there'll be about 2,000 to 3,000 jobs lost. Well, there's 90,000 people that will get more money in their pocket, and those 2,000 to 3,000, it's a very serious issue, but we have a 10,000 person shortage in employees right now in the state, so this is the best time to do it, when they can find another job.
Thank you very much. Don, why did you sustain the veto on the $15 minimum wage?
So first and foremost, Ann, 3 years ago we passed a minimum wage increase in Montpelier, which I supported, and it adjusted the minimum wage up each and every year. And as of today, our minimum wage is still going up. I did not support the $15 minimum wage because it's well-intentioned, but it has many negative consequences attributed to it. According to our legislative economist, it would cost thousands of jobs, reduce hours of people that are working for that wage, so they're ultimately netting the same amount of money. It would raise prices, and if you think about the increase in prices to people on fixed incomes, like seniors and so on living on pensions, the last issue pertaining to that is that there are over 2,000 families, approximately 3,000 children, that would fall off the benefits cliff. So they would actually lose money by getting this increase. So this was from the legislative economist that put all this information out. So on top of that, we'd see a cost increase to state government, higher education, and our nonprofits. 90% of all Vermont businesses are 20 or fewer employees. I believe we should instead be investing in workforce development programs instead of artificially increasing the minimum wage. Thank you.
Great, thank you. You want a sip of water there, Don? Oh, good. Okay. Okay, so this is a three-part question from a reader about school mergers, so
Okay.
listen carefully. They're actually yes, no. They want yes, no answers, but I suspect
Okay.
that may or may not be possible. But one, do you believe in forced school mergers? Two, towns have voted either for or against school mergers. Do you believe that votes should count? Number three, the intent of the legislature for Act 46 was to merge every school district in the state, yes or no? They want to know what Act 46 was about. That's the last question.
So I'm going to answer yes or no
Okay.
because I can.
All right.
So the first, can you
The first one is, do you believe in forced school mergers? This is school districts, right?
Right,
Okay.
school district mergers.
Yeah.
So the answer is yes, because I voted for Act 46.
Okay.
The reason that
So why'd you vote for Act 46?
Well, I voted for Act 46. That was a bill that was a lot of negotiation amongst the majority and the minority. And one of the things that I've been advocating for, and I continue in my legislative record, is to find cost containment in education. Well, the majority offered up to us caps on how much the cost could grow in any given year, the next year. So that's why I supported it. I also supported it because my school district is a large school district, and there was some positive impacts from Act 46 that we would see savings. So that's another reason I saw it. But what I've learned, and I want to answer those questions, but I want to tell you what I've learned this summer about forced mergers. I visited a number of schools. I've been all over Vermont, and I've talked to many Vermonters. But in Franklin, Vermont, when I'm voting on Act 46, I had no idea even where. I knew where Franklin was, but I never had been there. But what I've learned is Franklin School District, they have a great school district. Small, but great. They received an award from the Secretary or the Agency of Education less than 2 years ago about excellence in education. They also spend 10% less than their neighboring school districts they're going to be forced to merge with. So voting on Act 46 2.5 years ago, never knew about that. And I don't think that they should be forced to merge with districts that are not providing the best student outcomes and costing more. So I voted yes, but I've learned that that probably wasn't a good
now
thing.
you're saying no.
Now I'm saying no, because I've learned. And I want to be honest with people. When you're voting on these bills, you look at the good and the bad, but you never know how it's going to impact every single place. And there's another school district in the southern part of Vermont in the same situation. So I think we need to take a time out on these forced mergers and see how we're going to address this going forward.
I got you to say a little more than you usually do. We actually had to hold the stop sign
I'm
up.
sorry.
That
I
was
know.
good.
Thank you, Ann. I'm sorry. I've learned a
You were
lot.
passionate about that.
I am,
Maybe
because I
you
learned a
got
lot
that
about
one
this
down.
issue this summer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank
Yes.
you. Dave,
Sure.
did you get those questions?
I
Want me to
did.
repeat
I
them?
even wrote them down
Okay.
and everything.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yep.
we'll go.
Well, on forced mergers, I think it's actually a case-by-case basis. There are circumstances where sometimes you have districts next to each other that actually could function well together, but there's either historical town animosity or who knows what, when actually the schools function well and could function better together under one administrative merger. But I don't support all forced mergers, and I was on the Education Committee when we wrote Act 46. I understood it at the time as well as understanding it now, which is that there was an opportunity after the process concluded over the 3 years of those towns merging that could find, quote, dancing partners and find the efficiencies on the administrative side, to then have the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education look at those schools and districts that couldn't merge. And frankly, we knew that there would be 30 or 40 districts in the state that it probably wouldn't work for. And we said, if you look for a district to partner with, and it doesn't work to do so for any number of reasons, local vote, geography, many other challenges that exist, different operating structures, then the State Board of Education should grant an off-ramp for those of you that are creating good outcomes at a fair price for Vermonters across the board, because we are all in the cost of school together. That's part of the unique aspect of Act 60 in our education formula across the state. That's why the state has a role in this conversation, because we want to make sure every district has the opportunity for good outcomes at a reasonable price. Unfortunately, the State Board of Education is not following that intent in the way that we wrote it into the law. So I do believe the legislature should review that if the State Board of Education forces through the vast majority of these mergers, because that was not in our intention. I addressed whether town votes should matter, and I discussed the intent. So I think I've addressed all three aspects.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Back at you here, Dave.
Sure.
So this is a long question from a reader, so bear with me. It's important though.
Great.
What can you do to get national political influence out of Vermont state elections? Will you do something specific to A, eliminate all out-of-state donations to all elections, Vermont candidates and issues? That was part one. Part two, eliminate corporate paid employees' PACs access to all state government meetings, committees, and et cetera. So,
All right.
there you go.
Well, thank you for the question. Well, there's certain challenges with respect to our federal constitution and Supreme Court rulings with respect to the ability to truly limit corporate influence in the political process, which I think is extremely frustrating. Citizens United was a wrong decision in my interpretation. Corporations are not people, and my campaign has not taken a single corporate donation in juxtaposition to my opponent. So that's one difference is if you start by not taking those dollars, then you're going to be much less influenced by them. I also have not been the beneficiary of over $200,000 of out-of-state super PAC purchases, as my opponent has, and had an out-of-state super PAC pushed to spend money in the state, I would have made a clear statement that I would not want them to do so. Again, I didn't have that opportunity, and that's okay with me, but I believe it's Vermonters who should be the primary supporters of campaigns and not corporations. I support public financing. We could, as a state, put through public financing law and finance it so that candidates wouldn't need to do the dialing for dollars or reaching out to those corporations for money, and that would lessen that influence. And if all candidates were involved in that, then taxpayers could feel satisfied that their money went to the side of the political aisle that they most support. Lastly, as far as corporate paid access to meetings, the state of Vermont and the State House is an open and welcoming place for anybody and everybody. Whether you're paid by a corporate lobbyist, or whether you're a farmer in Tunbridge, or whether you're a citizen from Brattleboro or Franklin or Canaan, everybody is welcome in the State House. So I would never restrict anybody, whether they're corporate paid or not, from participating in the political process. But again, their influence would be lessened if they weren't also able to write those campaign checks around election time to gain further access to elected leaders.
Thank you very much. Don?
So first I want to clarify a few points that David made. First and foremost is that a candidate cannot cooperate, talk to, or even know about any PAC money. So I want to make sure that's clear. We didn't ask for, nor did we know we were going to receive any money from out of Vermont. And if we did cooperate or talk with them, we'd be violating the law. So I think we both know that.
Right, but anybody can say, I don't want this publicly.
Well, we can't do that with PACs. So as far as any out-of-state influence, I've got a strong record. I will stand by that. I've never been influenced by anybody that's made an investment in my campaign or any of our caucus members' campaign. You vote on the issues and how they best serve Vermonters. That's how I've always done it. That's how I will do it if I'm elected lieutenant governor. It's not going to change how I vote. I think everyone should have access to any state meeting. I believe in transparency. I believe that people have the right to know what their government is doing and have access at any time they should ever want to. Finally, I want to make a point. 90% of the contributions I've had to my campaign have come from hardworking Vermonters. So over 90% of the money I raised came from Vermonters. I'm proud of that, and I really appreciate their support and their belief that I can do a good job as lieutenant governor. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Don? Property taxes in towns like Stannard with no corporate tax base are again rising beyond our means to pay. What do you propose to do to lower our property taxes? Would you consider an income-based way of funding education instead of the property tax?
So I would not, so right now, I think we want to make sure and clear, over 70% of people pay their property taxes based on income taxes. One of the things I started off with tonight, and I've been campaigning about all through the state, is we cannot sustain the cost of our education today. That's the problem. We want to have great schools for our kids, our communities. The schools are heart and soul of our community, and we know that. Like David, I question these forced mergers, and I wonder how we're going to address that going forward. But I do not believe that we should shift from the current property tax to solely income tax. I believe that that will disconnect the voters further than the existing Act 60, Act 68 formula. We do need a new formula to pay for education, and I believe that there has to be a mix of taxes such as sales tax and all those things that we already do, but I do not and would not support shifting solely to the income tax.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and I just want to make sure folks understand that those 70% of Vermonters that pay based on income do feel the impact of their votes. Your income tax rate is adjusted based on your local voting, just as the property tax rate. So I just want to make sure folks don't somehow get misconstrued that folks that are paying based on income don't feel the effect of their vote. They very much do. There's a couple different aspects to this. One is the first piece of addressing property taxes is not just to draw a line on a piece of paper about teacher-student or student-staff ratios and say everybody's got to fit the same mold. That is not working with local school boards and local decision makers about what they want best for their children and how they know what's best for their children with respect to the services they need, because each community is different with respect to those services. However, I will go back to what I talked about earlier with my proposal to really look at the $2.4 billion human services budget, the $1.7 billion education spending in this state, and say, let's look at where they're both working with these youth. One from 0 through 5 years old and beyond, and the other primarily bringing in a student at 5 or 6 years old and meeting them for the first time. Why we don't have human services and education social services blended in our school setting to reduce redundancy, and that's where the cost savings are. The biggest cost driver in education spending is social services. So that's where we have to go down to the front lines and do the hard work, which unfortunately some are not willing to do. I would also make an adjustment on the income tax. Right now, wealthier Vermonters, my opponent being one of them, don't pay as much as a proportion of their income as the rest of us who are in that $90,000 or even $120,000 or lower income scenario. If wealthier Vermonters paid based on income the same way as the rest of us, it would actually create a $30 million savings for working class Vermonters, while those who are wealthier would pay their fair share to that same $30 million. That doesn't address the cost of school, which I addressed around social services, but it does address equity. And that is something I think we need to do.
Thank you, Dave. So a reader has said that he or she, well, it's actually she lives in East Albany, and she wants to know, Dave, where you stand on the Casella landfill expansion and extension, how you protect the water quality of Lake Memphremagog, Lake Champlain, and all of Vermont's water resources. I think you know that we've had quite a bit of reporting on Casella and some leachate that has been found in local sources of water.
Well, I think this touches on a number of things. One is yet another bill that the governor vetoed was a bill around corporate accountability for pollution of our waterways and making sure that folks that live near those kinds of polluting circumstances that corporations have done, that those corporations will pay for the health monitoring of Vermonters who are affected by that, whether they're down in Bennington and Bennington County or up near Albany and Cavendish and in that area. Again, the governor vetoed that. My opponent and his party sustained that veto. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this issue. With respect to the expanding of the landfill, I don't think we should have to expand a landfill. At the same time, I've heard from folks in the Northeast Kingdom that mandatory recycling or mandatory composting is a challenge for a lot of small communities who don't have the resources to implement that. All of these issues are interrelated. We need to divert more from the landfill, and even Chittenden Solid Waste has gotten rid of some of the reuse centers that are at the land drop-offs, which I think we need to reinstitute so folks can use good things rather than have them thrown in the landfill and filling up Cavendish landfill. Two, we need to encourage and keep moving forward with composting and diverting more from the landfill. We need to support more recycling and more reuse. And those all take planning, foresight, and vision. And so expanding a landfill allows an out where we then aren't pressured into doing that work that we need to do to really examine all the waste and all the consumption that we have and how to make it less impactful for communities like Albany, Cavendish, and others in the Northeast Kingdom.
Great, thank you. Don?
Can you just ask the question again?
Oh, sure. Let me just find it. I've got an Excel spreadsheet that's a little hard to read. Okay, here we go. Where do you stand on the Casella landfill expansion and extension? How will you protect the water quality of Lake Memphremagog, Lake Champlain, and all of Vermont's water resources?
So at this point, I do support the expansion of the landfill. I have talked to many residents in the area. I have a colleague that's from Coventry. But I do want to say this, that I also believe in our permitting process. We have a very extensive process that is being undertaken to expand this landfill. And if there are problems with contamination or anything, that we definitely have to address it before we do expand. But this summer, part of my traveling around the state, I did tour that facility, and we had an engineer who was on site who took us through the landfill. And it was a very interesting educational experience to understand what's going on. With that said, I do agree with my opponent that we have to continue to focus on recycling. We have to look at further measures of putting less and less in the landfill, but we can't ignore the fact that we still need a landfill. So this one is almost full. We have to be proactive, I believe, and pragmatic, and I would support the expansion as long as we deal with these pollution or these elevated levels that we're now finding.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions here. One is directed at you, Don, and one is directed at you, Dave. So I'm just going to take them now separately. Mr. Turner, this is from someone in Milton. Mr. Turner, a spokesperson for your campaign in the context of a discussion, Governor Scott's signing of a gun control in the discussion of Governor Scott's signing of gun control laws, wrote that you supported laws removing guns from domestic abusers and those with documented mental health issues in the same sentence. In other words, it seemed like the two were made equivalent. Do you view those who engage in domestic abuse and those who have a mental health diagnosis as being equally dangerous?
I'm concerned about both, yes, I do. I think that those are both very, very serious issues that we have to address, that we, domestic abuse, there's no tolerance. I have no tolerance for that at all. And for mental health, I want to find ways that we can help these people. I have some experience as a fire and rescue chief. I've been on calls with people with mental health illness, and it's a very scary time. And I want to make sure that we help all Vermonters that are facing these mental health challenges. So I don't see them the same, but I do think that they're both very serious, and that both of them with guns are bad.
Great, thank you. Dave, this is a question from someone in Charlotte. The reader says, you have pushed legislation in the past to protect practitioners recommending unproven Lyme disease treatments and have supported parents hoping to avoid immunizing their children. Both positions are against scientific data and potentially will have negative public health consequences. Would you please clarify your position on the use of scientific data to guide your legislative agenda? Also, please explain your position on the role of the legislature in directing medical care.
Sure. First, I want to compliment my opponent on the last answer, because it is very difficult with respect to the gun issue and the different concerns of different aspects of the community. And I suspect when he made his statement, he was trying to be concise, which in the world of politics you have to be, but that they're both important issues, and I don't think he meant to conflate them, and I think he answered that well. So I want to thank him for that and thank the questioner on that.
Thank you, David.
With respect to each of these issues, my concern about vaccines is not actually about the scientific evidence of their health efficacy and their what they do for our community. I think they do amazing things. It's a question of whether or not government should be forcing people to accept vaccinations, especially when there's another 250 to 300 in the pipeline from the pharmaceutical industry, the same industry that has brought us many other drugs that we've learned later they claim were not harmful, but they've made themselves a lot of money and have given us things like our opiate addiction problem and others. So the science behind vaccine is sound. I think vaccines do good for our communities. My daughter is vaccinated. But it's a question of whether or not government should be forcing that onto individuals, which is different than a scientific question. With respect to Lyme, there's actually tremendous excellent research coming out of Johns Hopkins University and Stanford University, highly regarded medical institutions, with respect to the persistence of Lyme bacteria after the use of short-term antibiotics, including doxycycline and doxycycline, for only a week or even a month. And there is a very active Lyme-literate medical community applying practices beyond what the CDC recommends. The CDC's Infectious Disease Control Board actually has a number of conflicts of interest, both researching vaccines for Lyme, as well as connections with the pharmaceutical industry. And so yes, like many, I do question when sometimes our government agencies are a bit too infused with corporate influence with respect to some of the outcomes and decisions they make. And I believe, given the challenges we have in Vermont with Lyme disease, that allowing our population that is severely affected, unable to work, unable to provide for their family, alternative opportunities to get better, they should be allowed to take that risk. It's their own risk. It's not a risk to anybody else. And I stand by that.
Great, thank you. There's another question for you in particular, but I think Don probably has a response too. So this has to do with a per parcel fee. On a recent episode of VPR's Vermont Edition, in reference to water pollution in the state, you reaffirmed your support for a per parcel fee, David, saying, "We're all in this together." You seemingly equate pollution of Lake Champlain and its tributaries with that of the Connecticut River watershed and other Vermont waterways. But this reader says, and he's from Holland, the Vermont, apparently 41 million gallons of wastewater, partially treated and untreated effluents, have gone into Lake Champlain from around the lake, from tributaries that feed the lake. And only 1.7 million gallons have entered the Connecticut River. Mr. Zuckerman, how can you honestly justify property owners who do not contribute to Lake Champlain pollution being forced to pay on an equal basis for years of cavalier legislative indifference, his words, not mine, and urban neglect? I didn't get any state subsidies when I installed my $5,000 compliant septic system. Perhaps I could be issued a retroactive tax credit. It's more of a comment than a question,
Sure.
but could you
I think
talk?
I got the question. I think
okay.
I can.
Great.
I think I can handle it.
Okay.
So a couple things. I did reaffirm that I support a per parcel fee, and I'm going to tell a brief story and get into the rest of the gentleman's comments. I took a call from a Underhill resident at my lieutenant governor's office when one of those combined sewer overflows happened in Burlington, and he was livid that the city was allowed to pollute the lake in that way. And I said, first of all, the legislature passed a law a few years ago to make sure you would know that that was happening. And so if people now know more about it, that's because the legislature took a proactive regulatory stance to say the public deserves to know in a transparent way about these combined sewer overflows. Because frankly, many of us felt that once that happened and people knew more about it, they would get more upset, would get more supportive of the political process trying to do something about cleaning the waterways of our state. I said, but sir, I don't know how much you make, but to do this properly, whether it's Lake Champlain, and I'm going to get to the Connecticut River as well, and the waterways on this side of the state, I said, no matter what, it's going to cost millions and close to $1 billion to do so. As angry as you are you prepared to pay $20 to $40 a year? And he said, I make $17 an hour, but you can bet your, you know what, that I would be happy to pay $20 to $40 to make it so that our waterways were clean. Now, to the caller's question, or the written-in question, this money is not just for Lake Champlain, and the pollution is not just combined sewer overflows. There are urban area runoff issues with combined sewer. There are agricultural issues, and frankly, we need to get our farmers a better dollar for their milk and paid better, and I would go for a Vermont brand of milk. I probably don't have time to go into detail on that, to get more money from the marketplace so farmers are better paid, because then they wouldn't stretch their land to every corner and ultimately lead to some agricultural runoff. And our roadways are part of the runoff. And in the Connecticut River, it's nitrogen. It's for the other side of the state, it's phosphorus. But there are water quality issues everywhere, and everybody's got to be paying in because water quality is fundamental to our tourism and our livelihood and our health. Thank you,
Dave. Don?
I do not support a per parcel fee.
So how would you pay for Lake Champlain cleanup?
So we have been financing lake cleanup or water cleanup. I think we have to look at the problem entirely. It's not a Lake Champlain, as the reader suggests, but we do have to look at the whole thing. And as I said, I've voted a number of times for capital budgets, millions and millions of dollars to clean up water in Vermont. And I will continue to support that, but I'm not going to do it when we have money available today, and I'm not going to do it as long as we keep blaming the farmers for everything. But I do want to say, and I'm happy to say, that we can invest money into technical upgrades, and I'm happy to report tonight that I know that next week in Burlington, they're voting on a $30 million bond to start to address this problem that they've been having. And I believe there's another city, I think it may be Montpelier, that's also doing that. So we need to look at these technical upgrades. We got to create greater capacity. We got to have better internal controls. But first and foremost, we got to stop making a mess. And that's what I think that is starting to be realized now. So we're working on better practices for agriculture. Those have been adopted for the large farms, and now we're working on small farms. But I will not support any kind of tax on water cleanup until which time we have a solid plan and we use the money that we already have in capital budgets. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So the time is drawing near for the final statements, but there's one more question here. This is from a reader in Greensboro. Don, would you consider encouraging legislation to support volunteerism by offering tax incentives to individuals participating in key roles in the community, such as EMS and the fire service, and also offer incentives to small businesses to allow their employees to leave the workplace to serve these critical functions?
Absolutely. My background, I joined the fire department in Milton when I was 17. I'm proud to say I was actually at a fire call this morning, unfortunately, and we lost a house. Fortunately, no one was injured. But we need these people. Especially up here in the Northeast Kingdom, we are seeing stations closed and so on. We have to do something. I have done a lot of research, spent my entire life in the emergency services and giving to my community, because there's no greater feeling than helping your neighbor, especially like this morning. And I would do anything to do that. Vermont is one of the few states, there are 35 other states that offer an incentive for these positions. The state of Maine is in the process of adopting a opt-in type deal. I'm going to, if I'm elected, that is one of my planks that I will focus my energy on, is working with the governor, with the legislature, to try to figure out a way to not only help recruit people for these services, but to retain them. And that's what the driving force for some incentive for a program like you offered or mentioned, Ed.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take credit for that great idea, but it actually came from a reader.
Well,
so.
Thank you from the reader. Thank you
yeah,
from the
thank
reader.
you from the reader. So for the reader, Dave, what do you think?
Sure. Well, I would certainly like to promise everybody everything. And I think this is a good idea and one we should move forward with. But what I keep hearing is we already are spending money on water quality, but it's not enough, but we should only do it in that regard. We shouldn't raise any money to pay for anything. When you actually look at the state budget, there's $1 billion in tax credits already. That's one of the reasons we don't have money for many of the things that we need, whether it's some of the issues in our schools and the state funding so that local taxes could be lower, or whether it's water quality. So yes, I of course support the idea of tax credits for volunteerism, but I would say one of the best ways to help our rural squads is to help people move here. And by helping people move here, we could invest in broadband, for instance, so that people could live and work in these rural areas, which would mean they'd be residents that would be staying in the community and therefore would be potential volunteers. I've also talked to some people on volunteer squads that have talked about their changes the legislature has made with respect to the training requirements, and that some folks just don't have the time anymore to go through all the training requirements and be available for all the calls. So we could look at that and say, well, we want high quality first responders, but we also want to make sure we don't force people out of being volunteers in the first responder corps by making the job or the volunteerism so onerous. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at this. Some of them cost money, some of them don't. And I'm more than happy to work with both Don, if I'm lieutenant governor and he's town manager of Milton, or vice versa, to continue to look at how we can do this. But again, we've got to get back to reality on how much money there is. And if we don't want to spend money on clean water, and we don't want to spend money on everything else, how are we going to start lowering how much money we have by also adding more and more tax credits into the mix? That's where sometimes the reality of a budget versus what we have to spend makes it challenging, and I think people have to be aware of that.
Great, thank you, Dave. So as agreed in our little coin toss. Don is going to start with his closing statements, and then Dave will have the final word. And so, Don, please.
Thank you, Ann. And thank you all for being here tonight. It's a great pleasure to come and have this opportunity to come to this beautiful facility in Greensboro. I'm Don Turner. I've spent my entire life as a public servant in my community. I've spent 13 years in the legislature, 7 years as the House Minority Leader. I work really hard. I'll work really hard for you in Lieutenant Governor's office. I believe that I can do a good job, and I will work hard for all of you. Vermont is a great place. We live here because we love it. It's beautiful. It's safe, mostly. But it's a great place. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But what I've heard this summer and what I've learned in my 13 years in the legislature and 7 as leader driving around the state, people can't afford to live here. They can't afford to live here. What are we going to do about that? We have a lot of things we'd like to do for people. David said some and I've said some. But if you can't afford to buy your medicine or buy your food, you can't afford to live here. I will focus on that issue and growing our economy in a way where people can stay here and be prosperous. I will do that by working on an issue, not a partisanship manner, but a partnership. I've done that my whole life. Find a challenge, put together a team to fix it, and fix it. It doesn't matter I'm a Republican or a progressive or Democrat. That's how I've worked, and that's how I will work. I've been on call for Milton my entire life, and now I want to be on call for Vermont as your next Lieutenant Governor. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Dave?
Well, thank you, Don. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, audience here in Greensboro and those throughout the internet world. It's been an incredible honor to serve for you the last 2 years as Lieutenant Governor and for 18 years before that in the Vermont legislature. You have a clear choice before you with regard to the issues and with regard to partisanship. I bring the experience of running an efficient and fair Senate, including appointing 2 Republican chairs to committees out of a body that was 7 Republicans and 30 Democrats. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the country. I think that's an example of working with people for their skills, not their labels. As a small business entrepreneur, I know the challenges: payroll, employee retention, building markets, and finding efficiencies. As a farmer, I think about immediate problems you have to solve day to day, and you also have to plan long term. How to build your soil and nurture it so that it's stronger in the future. How to sequester carbon as one of the methods of reducing our impact on the climate. And as a farmer, I get to work at home with my wife and daughter and work with those struggles of her suffering from Lyme disease and my daughter in middle school, which I don't think I have to say another word about the challenges of that. As a legislator, I've worked for working people my whole life, fighting to raise the minimum wage, fighting for universal health care, fighting on the issue of climate change, supporting renewable energy, and including the energy goal of 90% renewable by 2050. The effects on our economy are huge. Maple industry, ski industry, agriculture, tourism. I've fought for clean water, the lifeblood of our communities, also related to tourism, and I've also fought for corporate responsibility with respect to our water. Government transparency, I've released my tax returns, both last race when we didn't have to, when I was running for Lieutenant Governor, and this time, so that you know what's going on. Well, I'll wrap it up with my last 15 seconds to say I will continue to govern fairly and with an open mind and heart for Vermonters and improving our future. When this election happened 2 years ago, that's all I could think about. My daughter, climate change, jobs, Supreme Court. And I'll continue to work for you in Vermont. Thank you.
So I want to thank everyone, including the 2 candidates here, Don Turner and Dave Zuckerman. And thanks to all of you for coming out to listen to the 2 of them. And many thanks again to the Highland Center for the Arts. Have a good night.